Okay, so welcome back to another DCEP Northern Applied Hub special, coronavirus special. We're here today with Zoe Moffat. Can you just give us a brief description of what you do and, yes, a brief description of what you do and what you are at the present moment in time?
Yeah, sure. So hi, thanks for having me. I am currently in my second year on the DPsych program at Glasgow Caledonian as a trainee sports psychologist. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
Cool. And this particular episode in particular, we're going through looking at Zoe's background and maybe get some ideas about how she's going through this potential quarantine period and any potential tips that she may have. One thing I would say before we go on, this obviously being a coronavirus quarantine lockdown special, we must pay our sympathies for those who are or have been affected by the virus itself. And although we may state opportunities, we don't necessarily mean that you should be taken advantage of or ill advantage unethically of this particular situation. But likewise, these tips are aimed for you graduates, undergraduates, or whoever may be listening to help you potentially beyond this in this quarantine, but also outside of the quarantine. So talking about being in quarantine, how are you finding it so far?
Okay. I mean, I'm pretty active. I still play and coach quite a lot of tennis, so obviously that's stopped, which is challenging, but kind of finding other ways to exercise, which is very important for me. I think it's challenging for everyone, but I'm doing okay.
You was it like a bit of shock to the system, was it?
Yeah, I think I didn't think it was gonna happen as quickly as it did. So that was a bit surprising when it was like we're in lockdown from today. But yeah, I think definitely surprised me, caught me off guard a little bit. I knew it was coming, but maybe not as quickly as it did.
Yeah, like I think with a lot of people, it's happened like that. It's almost like on the news, suddenly your shops are closed or whatever, and everyone's like, "Oh my God, what's kind of happening here? This is more serious than I thought so." So could you? So when obviously you were a, if I believe you're right, former Leeds Beckett student, and beyond that you were beyond that, obviously you went from your undergraduate from psychology route into the sports psychology. Was that a easy transition to make from the undergraduate to the masters, or was it a little bit harder than I thought?
I think it was different. I think on the masters there's maybe a bit more expectation of what you want to do. I think for me it was quite smooth, relatively speaking. I think it just maybe putting a bit more time in. But I think in terms of the actual transition, I think the transition from the masters to what I'm doing now was probably bigger than undergrad to masters. But yeah, I think it's definitely a step in a different direction, and I think like you need to really want to do it.
That's quite a pertinent point you said, and you mentioned about the transition from masters to what you're doing now being a lot harder. Could you elaborate upon that?
It's just different. I think, you know, the DPsych program's a pretty cool program. I mean I love my time at Leeds Beckett. I think the masters there was great, and it set me up with lots of, you know, fantastic opportunities, as did my time at, you know, Sterling in America before that. I think obviously time's a big one. So this is a full-time PhD. So for me, I think I worked pretty hard on my masters, but probably a step up in terms of time. And then I think the biggest shift for me onto this program is the the amount of time you spend looking inwards. I think on kind of my undergrad and in the masters, it's a lot about how do you learn new things, how do you do new things, how do you get new skills. Whereas maybe as part of this program, it's shifted a bit more to, well, why do I do something like this? What does that mean to me? How do I feel about being a certain way? And those kind of inward reflections are probably a lot harder on a personal level.
So it's that learning new ways to self-reflect in order to improve your practice, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. We have quite a lot of like process groups and kind of getting everyone together and kind of breaking down situations and things that have happened. And I think that kind of process of looking inward has been huge for me.
So it's definitely helped with your practice and potential education then.
For sure. I think it's something that I probably would have liked to have done a bit earlier. I think that, you know, it's very easy to go like, well, I did this or I did that. But that kind of taking that pause and looking at why you've done it and what that means to you and what the motives behind you doing that were, I think are very powerful. And I think if, you know, people can start getting a grasp of that a bit sooner, that would be really useful.
So what is the main difference between a trainee practitioner working in the DSET program to being a student? What are the main differences in your opinion?
As in between doing my program and doing a master's, or my program and doing stage 2 like independently?
Yeah, both.
Compared to the independent route, it's hard to know. I mean, I've only had some conversations with people. I mean, we obviously have a lot more structure, I'd say, and a lot more guidance than the stage 2 independent route, and we've got a group of us, so that's quite useful in terms of just bouncing ideas off and having conversations. That's probably as in depth with, well, I probably could go in more depth, but it's challenging because I've not done independent route, so it's just based on conversations. In terms of this compared to my previous education, I think being independent is obviously the big thing. I think, you know, within, you know, previous university setups, it's all very, you're walked through it quite a lot. Like, obviously you've got to go off and do work yourself, but it's as much as it's student led, there's a lot of structure, whereas this is more obviously independent, as you'd expect at this level of study. And then in terms of, you know, placement and applied stuff, you're obviously kind of out there on your own. I mean, I'm very fortunate that when I was at Leeds Beckett, we had the practicum module, which gave me some awesome opportunities in youth football. But that was again something where everything was very planned. It was all walked through with staff. There was staff there when we were delivering it. There was staff that helped us evaluate it. Whereas this, like, we get huge staff input, and the team at Glasgow are fantastic. But at the same time, it's a lot more kind of you out there on your own, doing you. So
yeah, so more remotely. Wait, you got any headphones? Because I can kind of hear yourself with the speakers in the background. Sorry about
that. Possibly. Give me 2 seconds.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. We'll be back shortly.
I think I'm struggling. Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah, I've only got ones that for my phone, which don't go into my laptop.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll be fine with that then. Don't worry about it.
What I'll do is I'll mute myself, my side, when you're speaking, and that should potentially stop it.
I think what it is, it's the speakers, because I can hear myself in the background twice. So let's give that a go. Oh yeah, that's a lot better. Okay. Yeah, so you're talking about working, kind of that idea of working remotely. Do you, or being, let's say, more remote in this situation, do you have to work more remotely during this working for the DSET?
So it's a D-Psych, yeah, but on the D-Psych, so you have a placement with, you know, different organizations. I wouldn't necessarily say it's remote in that, you know, we have a lot of support. So we have a supervisor at the university who kind of overlooks everything. And then in the first year of the program, you're in kind of class 9 to 5 on a Thursday and a Friday. And then in your second year and your third year, you're in on just a Friday. So we have quite a lot of support in terms of making sure that, you know, what we're doing is ethical and having conversations about being effective and all of those types of things. It's definitely not, you know, like you're out on your own in the dark, which is something I think some people have experienced. But it's definitely more, you know, singular in that, you know, when you're practicing, you know, you're out there doing it yourself and then coming back into the group rather than having the group with you all the time, which is maybe what, you know, and for good reason. It's all about trying to keep people safe, but within you know, lower levels of study, it's very supported in every aspect of the journey, like with direct contact, as opposed to supported through kind of conversations around what you're doing.
Yeah, so yeah, so I can see that potentially being more supported, and I imagine that being very scary if you're just kind of saying, hey, you're a D-Psych now, off you go on your own, good luck kind of thing. So it's good that you're getting that support that you need, that may not be that some people, as you said yourself, have not got that support in the past. So it's good that you're getting that support. One thing I want to ask really is, what does your applied work, or many people sitting here watching or listening to this from live stream podcast would want to know, what does your applied work, what is your applied work, and what is your main roles of your applied work?
So I think the big thing for me is supporting the people that I interact with. So whether that's, you know, the athletes or the coaches or other support staff within the organization, you know, parents as well. They're huge. I do most of my stuff with youth athletes, and getting the parents involved is massive. And I think that for me right now, that probably works under kind of one of three strands. The first one is probably what we typically think of in terms of sports psych, which is the performance aspect. How does the work I do kind of help improve their performance? The second one, which is probably a growing narrative, I think, in sports psych, which is fantastic, is the well-being angle of, you know, how do we make sure that the people operating in the environments that we go into are fundamentally happy? Because that's obviously good for them as people and for performance in the long run. And then the third strand, kind of particularly big with the youth athletes, is kind of a youth development model. I think that's, you know, big for people at all stages in their career, is, you know, how do we look to improve and get better? But I think, you know, from a kind of psychosocial development standpoint, with kind of youth athletes, that's probably bigger. So that's kind of how I'd probably break down what I do in an applied setting. And then obviously, like, yeah, so with the D-Psych program, alongside that, we kind of have a research strand, and then kind of more kind of assignments around the applied work we're doing. That's how I'd break it down.
No, it seems right. You seem like you're very busy, and seems like you're very full on with this. Did this, working as a D-Psych, did it meet your expectations you had when you were a student?
I mean, technically still a student, so a little bit cheeky. Did it meet my expectations? I think in some ways it probably exceeded my expectations. I think in other ways it probably changed my expectations slightly. I think that's partly a consequence of just what kind of, you know, previous education had looked like. I think, you know, previously it's probably been a lot of, here's stuff to do, go do it. Whereas this is more like, here's an idea, kind of take with it, roll with it, see what kind of fits for you, and that kind of independent stuff that I spoke about earlier. So that was probably different to what I expected. In terms of, support and experiences as a trainee, I think it probably exceeded what I expected. I kind of looked at different routes and different options for me to kind of get to this point. And had some, fantastic offers, and ended up choosing this route. And I think, for me, it's probably been the best choice. I think that structure and that support is something that's been, fantastic to me and really important for my development.
So it's that control and authority over being able to have control and authority about what you do as a D-site, which is you didn't necessarily had as a student. It was more directed.
Yeah, I think that's probably a big one. I don't know if that's something that you found as well, but with the masters at Beck, it was fantastic. I got so much from it. I'm so glad I went and did it. But yeah, I think it's that balance, isn't it? And I think I understand why. I mean, I kind of hinted at it earlier. It's all about making sure, what we're doing is safe and that it is ethical, and that, it's very easy, I think, to potentially do the wrong things and to do damage if you do it wrong. And it's important that as a field, we're making sure that people are safe and that they are ethical. And that's probably something that's big that we reflect on a lot, is where does the ethics sit on what you're doing. So I definitely understand and appreciate and was thankful at the time for why stuff looks how it does. But then it can be a bit of a jump.
Yeah, I can in a way relate to that. Like, for me personally, leaving college and school and going from that to kind of dependent learning, like you mentioned, here's a load of work, you do everything in the lecture, and then go and do your homework or whatever it is, compared to going off to university where it's like, oh God, I haven't 5 minutes left of the lecture, read this book from page 100 to 333.
Yeah.
All the students think, great, no extra reading. But I think for many students, that jump from the dependent learning to independent learning, where you're with the lecturers to a certain extent don't really mind what you get, providing that you do the work necessarily, and some probably don't even think that at all. It's a different mindset, it's a different structure. You have to develop your own structures, and it seems like what you're telling me is this is the next step up in independent learning, and that it's more of a creative idea, you put your spin on it, rather than being a this is the syllabus, go and do the work. Please state if I've said that wrong or misinterpret that in any way.
No, I think I agree. I think, there's obviously like a very strict framework and lots of guidelines and criteria that we have to meet as part of the program. I mean, I've seen the portfolio. It's literally like piles high of documents for, what we have to do. I think I'm probably quite fortunate in that I've always learned quite independently. So I've obviously played a lot of tennis. I've competed quite a lot. At 16, I went to a tennis academy. That's how I actually started my journey in sports psych. I started working with some sports psychs when I was there. And as part of that, I was basically training full time. So taught myself, went to school a bit, but I had to teach myself quite a bit of my A-levels. So kind of independent learning was something that I'd already kind of taken hold of quite early. But yeah, I think, that's probably the thing with, university, undergrad, masters, and then again on the D-Psych program, is that, it's taking as many opportunities as you can get and doing as much as you can on the side, and, things, as much as there is structure, and that decreases probably as you go along the journey, there's always opportunities, and it's, you know, seeing what you can find, seeing what you can do, and really trying to take advantage of everything that's around you to you know, be the best that you can be. I think it's one of those things where the more you put in, the more you're probably going to get out of it. But I think that's the same. I don't think that's, you know, exclusive to sports psych. I think that's the same kind of whatever you choose to put your mind to career wise.
Yeah, it's quite pertinent points you mentioned there, and it really leads on nicely to the next question. Seeing people are working more remotely now whilst they're in quarantine. So how has the quarantine affected your work?
In terms of sports psych, I think the biggest thing is needing to take things online. I think that's something which I probably hadn't done all that much of. I'd done a little bit, you know, when it was kind of needed, but it's not something that I'd kind of proactively gone about looking at doing. Now, obviously, kind of in-person, face-to-face stuff isn't a possibility, so that's kind of forced me to consider in a way how I, you know, use online skills to conduct like consultancy work, and how I practice online. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing. I think for me, you know, sports psych is a very personable, you know, kind of career to get into, and it's a lot to do with kind of how you interact and how you are with people. So I think finding a way to do that through a screen has definitely been something that I've thought quite a lot about, in terms of, you know, how do you really get you and that relationship to develop through a screen. So that's probably been the biggest difference for me. I can't actually hear you just now, Adam. I think you might have been
Sorry, I
muted.
muted my microphone by accident. I clicked the button and I was talking and nothing was coming out. Sorry about that. But like what you said, it can be very challenging to have a conversation with someone through like the internet when they're not there personally. They're not there. People may not necessarily have an eye contact. Like, for instance, when we come to the digital skills, like you mentioned, I know to try and engage an audience, to have an eye contact, I've got to look at the camera here in front of me. But I do sometimes look down at the screen, and when some people will say, why is his eyes looking at the corner and stuff like that, rather than looking at, but yeah, it's just like you said, it's not necessarily a natural thing to have a conversation with someone who may not necessarily be there. You may be getting like snippets and that kind of thing. Have you found that quite challenging to try and get used to this new normal where we've got to talk remotely, like what we're doing now?
Yes and no. I think for, you know, some of the people that I work with, it's actually been easier. I think having that distance for some people can be more helpful. I think that's something that's really important to acknowledge. It's really easy to get bogged down into the, you know, why is this not necessarily how I'd like it to be? But actually, for some people, it's better, and that really appreciating that for what it can be. I think the biggest challenge has probably been to do with like silence. You know, I'm quite a big advocate of silence. I think there's a lot of power in it. And I think it's sometimes challenging, you know, to read that through a screen. So whether it's just, you know, has someone paused because, you know, the question that you've asked or the reflection that you've made has been challenging for them, and this is them thinking, and this is them, you know, in a space of processing where we'd quite like to leave them there and give them that time and space? Or is it just that the internet's frozen and you've got a still of their face? So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges for me is managing that and trying to really establish whether what's going on is to do with the technology or to do with, with what's happening, or whether, you know, I need to give that person more space and more time to process whatever it is that's going on for them. You're muted again.
Okay, sorry about that. So
Yeah,
is it a struggle to read their body language well? I know that may sound like a stupid question, but yeah.
definitely not a stupid question. I think it's just different, isn't it? I don't necessarily want to say more difficult, but definitely different. I think, you know, for some people, I've had a few sessions where I'm looking at someone's forehead or the bottom of their chin as they've not managed to get the camera in the right place. So if it's a session like that, then, yeah, if it's one of those sessions, definitely more difficult to read body language. I think, you know, it's definitely different. I wouldn't say it's the same, but I don't necessarily, that, as I kind of said earlier, that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. And I think it's trying to, you know, take the positives from it and take what you can from the work you're doing and trying to do as, you know, good a job as you can for the people that you work with.
That's highly powerful stuff you've mentioned there. Next question I'm going to really ask is, how has the lockdown affected you personally? So you mentioned that work you do with people trying to derive body language, but how has the work affected you personally? Sorry, how's the lockdown affected you personally?
I think the big one is probably, I'll take it from a slightly more, you know, pessimistic angle first. I think, you know, seeing people, obviously not allowed to come into contact with people, and that can be quite challenging in terms of not having that face-to-face contact. I mean, obviously, you know, between sports psychology and coaching, it's very people-facing roles. So in what was normal, I spent a lot of time around people all the time. So that, on one hand, has been quite challenging. But on the other hand, it's meant that I've engaged with a lot of people that I maybe wouldn't have typically. So there's been kind of positives for that. What else? I think the balance between like productivity and going, this is a bit rubbish, has been a big one. I think, you know, that's probably been a personal battle, I'd say, is between you know, having a day where I'm like this is rubbish, like I can't do everything I want to do. I want to sit and eat cookies and watch Netflix. And also between being like, I've potentially got more time and I'm not doing as much of stuff that I would typically do in my day-to-day life. So how do I get this massive list of other things that I want to do and I could do done? That's probably the two big ones, is the social aspect and then the battle of productivity.
So that battle of productivity, is that also I take it that's affecting the work as well as you, not just your social life as well?
Yeah, I think for you know, applied stuff, that's been okay. I think that for, you know, in terms of like uni work and kind of the broader, you know, what do I want to do to keep developing as a person and a practitioner, that's been something that I've, you know, thought quite a lot about. I think, you know, with social media, it's easy to get sucked into what everyone else is doing, and I think that's probably been a challenge that I've probably faced through this period.
So have you been heavily involved in social media regarding work or even socially whilst being on lockdown, if that's okay to ask?
No, definitely you can ask. I'm not really a social media guru, should I say. I use it, I'm on it. I think it's something which for me it's more healthy to have a backseat. I think I could get quite consumed by things. So kind of doing more of that probably wouldn't be right for me. But I think, you see a lot, and on one hand, it has been massively helpful. I mean, I've done some online webinars or CPD. I mean, I've done a couple of webinars with, me and 3 guys have done something where I'd met one of them at a conference in December, and the other 2 I'd never met before. And it's one of those things where if this hadn't happened, would I have started, networking with those people? Probably not. Definitely not to the extent that we have. So on one hand, it's opened lots of doors for me in terms of speaking to new people. On the other hand, again, as I said, it's easy to see, what everyone else is doing, and that's probably the challenge. I mean, without getting into a broad topic debate about social media in general, but people obviously typically post the good things they're doing and everything that's happening, and in times like these, which are challenging for lots of people in different ways, that can be quite tricky.
Yeah, I can see what you mean. Like where you go on Instagram and someone's posted a lovely picture, perfect background lighting, the photographer's hidden his stuff in the far corner or whatever it is, and bemoaning life underneath it about how hard life is. And it's just a disconnect between, and like you said yourself, social media, people post what they want on social media or what they want to reflect from themselves. So the typical one may be, I don't know, a guy sitting around a pool in France or something with a laptop on his lap because he's trying to show how successful he is. He can travel Europe or whatever. But it's interesting what you said about social media and being able for yourself, being able to that has to take a back seat for you in order to develop yourself. And you mentioned the networking opportunities you're able to ascertain or obtain while on lockdown. Is there any particular tips in terms of networking whilst in quarantine you could potentially give anyone watching this podcast?
Don't be afraid to ask questions. I think that's the biggest thing. I think I can do quite a good job of that. But I think that's definitely something I've learned, and I think it's definitely something that helps you out. I think if you see something that you like, if someone says something that you're not sure about, even if you want to disagree, I think ask the question. I think a lot of the time people are more than happy to have those conversations with you, and if you show you're interested and you want to learn more, then people are happy to help. You might get kicked back every now and again. You might ask a question and you don't get the response, but if you keep asking the questions and putting yourself out there and not being and trying to put yourself out of your comfort zone with these things, that's probably the biggest thing. I think the number of times I've asked a question which has just been, I've seen something and been like, that could be quite interesting, said something, and it's started a whole path of discussion that if I hadn't asked the question, I never would have got all those opportunities further down the line. So yeah, I think that's my biggest one is ask the question, and if you can, try and put yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit every now and again.
So do you think you could utilize the skills that particular skill you've learned whilst in lockdown outside of lockdown in the up and coming, if so like to speak, the new normal?
I think it's a skill I've probably always used. I think it's just been used in a different way. I think, I've always asked questions, but I typically ask questions in the context that I'm in, or I then go and read about it tons. I'll have a question and then I'll spend the next, 3 hours on like internet platforms reading journal articles and finding out what I can. I think, in this period, I've been asking those questions, through an online CPD or to someone's, post that they've put up about something that sounds quite interesting. Or, when someone's been like, does anyone want to have a chat? I've just been like, yeah, sure. Like, I've got time. Like, it'll be interesting to speak to other people, and it's healthy to do that. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's different skills, but I think it's using skills differently, if that makes sense. Adam, I think you're muted. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
No,
I'll fix that problem. But likewise, you said it's utilizing those skills, identifying those skills, utilizing those skills, and being able to utilize them in this new normal, in this lockdown, in a different situation that may be beneficial to you personally.
yeah, I think it's, you know, trying to use what you've got, and there's definitely a space to try and develop new skills if you can. And in terms of the tech stuff, that's probably something I've done quite a bit. But no, I think the big one's definitely like just trying to explore different options to still develop in the way that you want to. And I think if you're proactive about that, there's tons of opportunities available for you.
So that's quite a pertinent point. If anyone's watching this, let us know down below. Are you utilizing this time in lockdown to network and develop skills? If you're okay with that, literally write that down in the comments below and we'll get discussion going. So moving on to the next question. What are the greatest threats and challenges you've found to your profession regarding the quarantine?
Tough question. I think resources is probably going to be one. A lot of sports are struggling at the moment. No live sport means challenges with revenue. How do they keep funding and sustaining that? And I think, sports psychology is definitely a growing field. And from what I know, from what I've heard, there's definitely far more opportunities than there'd maybe been previously. But I think that could possibly be one of the challenges moving forward is, how much resource the clubs, teams, organizations, athletes have available to them. And how do we as a field fit our services in within that. So I think that's arguably one of the biggest challenges that I can think of. I think there's probably some more experienced people that would have a better idea. But that's possibly what I'd say, which I think is definitely something to be aware of, because you could argue that in terms of, personal situations, getting back to sport, return to play, potential injury issues, that there's potentially going to be more demand for the service, but it's whether the service can be accessed by the people that need it. And I think that's an important question for people to reflect on, in terms of how does that sit with what they want to do and their needs as a practitioner and how they want to work.
Yeah, I can see that. What I would like to know is, from your opinion, when sport comes back again, do you think that would be, as the baseball commentator Vin Scully said, it'd be like a rainbow after the storm, in terms of people would want to see this, makes you feel better? Or is it a case of the sport comes back but no one's willing to partake in that sport because of the coronavirus and the fears of the lockdown, from your perspective?
I think people will definitely be keen to participate. I think, I've probably been quite amazed by, there's a bit of social psych in there about how they've put out that you're allowed to exercise once per day. And I've seen so many people, cycling, running, going for a walk, being outside. I think, having those restrictions placed on us has probably actually made people appreciate participating more. So I don't necessarily think there'll be an issue in terms of people participating. I think there could be some challenges at the elite end, because don't get me wrong, I'd love to be back in, being able to go to a 60,000 seater stadium, but I don't think that that's going to be happening very soon. So I think there's some challenges with regards to what that looks like. I think in terms of sport in general, I think it's going to be interesting. I think there's going to be tons of new opportunities. I think there's going to be tons of different perspectives. I think there's going to be, athletes that have had a break, and that was a break that they possibly really needed, and they're going to come back, refreshed and ready to go and excited and remotivated. I think there's also going to be some athletes for whom, having that break has been a real challenge, and, issues with identity and all sorts of other factors about, what does life look like when I'm not playing tennis, rugby, football, hockey. So I think there could be quite a lot of challenges in that to support people through, particularly those kind of Olympic sport athletes, who, if you've been working, 4 years of your life for this Olympic cycle, and now it's, as of right now, it's pushed back a year, that can be very challenging. So I think, there's going to be positives and challenges for different athletes depending on their situation. I think, coaches and support staff and organizations, it's going to be interesting in terms of, where that shift does go. If it does kind of go towards a more, holistic environment, if actually, because they've had so much time off, they now realize that they need money, and it shifts to an even more, how do we achieve top performance now? I think at the moment there's so many unanswered questions in terms of how is sport going to come back? What is it going to look like? How are we going to be able to structure it? That I definitely think there's going to be some interesting questions, but I think, sport is quite a universal thing. Most people play or watch, and I don't think that that's something that's going to be massively impacted by the lockdown. I hope it's not anyway. So we'll see. Time will tell.
Fingers crossed.
Totally.
Fingers crossed.
Totally.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said about the afterwards in terms of the staff, and I think the support staff, some people will probably include the psychologist as one of the coaches in that. We've had this discussion with Ross Strand. Of course, that resource you can look down below in the comments section, or the description section. But that idea of what's going to happen to these coaches, the support staff, will funding be cut, especially in the sports that rely on government funding, and how does that affect them? And you hear people like Martin Rooney saying, well, if I'm not going to get funding and I'm getting to that age now, I might as well retire because there's no Olympics on. It's these, like you said, the individual differences, and we're seeing situations like Barcelona, for instance, saying, well, £40 million for a football player is now too expensive in the current market we find ourselves in. And do we spend 40 million for a player who may make us that amount of money, or do we trade players to get a player to a cheaper price, and that way we can then keep our support staff on the books? Otherwise we're going to have to cut our support staff, and it's those business decisions that impact. And do you think that's impacting do you think they're taking psychology seriously when you hear people saying that, oh, we might need to cut the amount of money you earn and that kind of thing?
Tricky question. I think yes, I think, there's been quite a lot of high profile stories, in the media, and I think, taking athlete health seriously is a big priority for organizations now. I think in terms of the economics of sport, it's going to ask some serious questions. I think that it kind of goes far beyond the role of sports psychology. I think, it's easy to get sucked into the bubble of what your field is and what the implications for that are. I think the reality of coronavirus in sport, extends far beyond sports psychologists. I think it's important to acknowledge that we're just, one little piece of a very big puzzle. I think, you kind of reflected a really good point about coaches and support staff. I think we talk a lot about athlete journeys, and don't get me wrong, that's huge, but the people around them invest just as much. For coaches, they can spend more time with, their athletes and their families. And there can be a lot of pressure on them too. So I think, taking that full system approach in terms of looking at support staff as well is really important, because it's hard to underestimate what the impact of you know, a 4-year cycle has on the coaches as well as, you know, those around them. But no, I think it could have an impact. It could have a positive impact. It could have a, you know, maybe less positive impact. It's really hard to say, but I think it's keeping it in perspective that, you know, we're very fortunate. Well, I feel very fortunate to be in the position that I'm in, and, you know, there's lots of people around the world that are in very, very difficult situations, and appreciating that, you know, where what we have in the profession sits within, you know, a global scheme of what's going on is important to me. And, you know, for other people that might not be the case, and that's completely okay. You know, we all get into different roles and different professions for different reasons, but I think, you know, the challenges in the world go beyond where does sports psychology fit within sport. Yeah. You're
One
muted
thing I
again.
really should say is that when I asked that question, I realized that we are not economists, and we were trying to keep this within the sports psychology realm, within what does sports psychology, what is its role in times like these. And I think, like what you, and I'm just to reiterate what you said, there's a lot more things going on in the world at the moment than sport, and sports psychology as such is, without trying to make it sound too morbid, there are people dying from this disease, and there's people who've been heavily impacted by the financial implications because of COVID-19. So I think it's really good that you're grounded and in that respect. But going back to our interview, and that is, what do you think of sports psychology's role is during times like this?
Tough one. I think the biggest thing is, I guess a big part of it ultimately comes down to like what angle you take sports psychology from. I think there's lots of different perspectives within the field, which is important to acknowledge. I think for me, it's centered around supporting people, and that possibly sounds quite wishy-washy sometimes. But I think it's about, you know, how do we maintain athletes, you know, well-being and mental health? How do we do that for the coaches and the support staff and the parents and the organizations? You know, how can we look at athletes' motivation and their identity in these processes that, you know, are important for them as performers and people. I think it gives us time. I think it's easy to get sucked into the negativity of it, but I think, you know, certainly with some of the people that I've been working with, psychology is something they appreciate, is something that they understand is helpful for their performance, but something that, you know, ultimately they would rather spend time, you know, hitting a tennis ball, kicking a football, whatever sport it is. You know, people ultimately are typically in their sport because they want to play their sport, which is perfectly understandable and is what you want to see. But I think, you know, they've had a bit more time where they're like, well, actually, maybe we can do a little bit more, you know, sports psych stuff, or maybe we can have some time to practice this skill, which I maybe hadn't invested as much in. I think, you know, a big one for me has been, you know, one athlete I work with in particular is very results oriented. And for him, this period's actually meant, well, there's not a result that I'm chasing right now. So he's been able to go into the process a bit more rather than, you know, looking at the outcome. And I think that's quite healthy. So I think, you know, for some people, if you're able to get access to athletes, coaches, support staff, parents right now, there's actually possibly more opportunity to do a lot of that work because the outcome isn't necessarily there, and they've got the time to be able to do stuff. So that's in kind of like skill development, performance aspects. But yeah, I think the overarching theme is just trying to support athletes in being, you know, healthy and maintaining their well-being. And then, you know, I already did some research in coaches' well-being, so kind of looking at maintaining the well-being of all of those in the environments that you work in.
That is what you said is quite pertinent in a way. It's looking at how can we support and then you mentioned supporting the families as well, and even at the elite level where maybe they don't have as much impetus upon the actual athlete themselves, because vast majority of the time, unless you do gymnastics or something, they're going to be a grown adult, but they do have an impact emotionally, especially at the younger ages where they may be I don't know, banker, a chauffeur, a driver. The athlete wakes up to find themselves magically transported to the location they're meant to be competing at, and I think they often get forgotten in this whole argument, the whole debate in a way. Do you think that's true as well?
For sure. I think, the focus in sport has conventionally been on the athlete, and that's, for very good reason. The athlete is ultimately the person that is performing. I think, the perspectives are definitely growing, and there's kind of showing in the research and the media is that actually an athlete is so much bigger than the athlete. And that's not to take away from all the hard work that they put in, but it's that, there's lots of people around them that do that too. I think, for coaches and for sports psychs, you could do the best hour and a half session, the best 2-hour session with an athlete. You could create a fantastic, autonomy supportive environment. You could, provide them with unconditional positive regard. You could have them leaving the session feeling fantastic. If they then get in the car and on the way home, mum, dad, significant other is screaming at them because they missed a forehand on top of the net, then that can undermine all of the work just as easily. And I mean, it's incredibly tricky for parents. I mean, there was an article that came out yesterday about Matt Dawson's mum and concussion, and how she was there to essentially watch that he didn't get concussion, and that if he hurt his head, that she was there, and that she absolutely hated watching because she was scared about what was going to happen, but she had to be there to check that he was okay. And the emotional toll for parents is huge. I mean, in contact sports, that's massive. You alluded to it there. I mean, parents can often make a lot of difficult choices to support their kids, whether that's financially, whether that's time, whether it's driving around. I think that parents have tricky journeys with it too, and making sure that we can support them to be in a position to support their kids in the best way possible is huge. And it's trying to create those positive environments broadly, rather than a positive environment when they rock up for this one training session. So yeah, I think targeting parents and working with parents is really important. I think often they don't understand the journey. That's something that's been, as I said, tennis is my background. That's something there's been some really good research by Chris Harwood and Sam Thrower and a few other guys at Loughborough about parents in tennis. And often, it's easy to see the story of, when you look at elite athletes, you hear a lot of stories of, Serena Williams, who played 1 million hours of tennis with her dad in the garden, and how, that's fantastic and arguably one of the greatest athletes of all time, but that having your 5, 6, 7-year-old playing 18 hours a week isn't going to be good for them. And understanding for parents that it's ultimately their kid's journey is really important.
Yeah, and I think the converse is true as well. There's some exceptions to the rule, like Jonah Lomu, who practically was brought up by the street gangs in New Zealand, and there's an American football player, British guy, plays for the Carolina Panthers, and his name just completely escapes my mind, but he was an illegal immigrant shipped in via Holland, so he lived a couple of years of his life on the streets of London, then in an orphanage, and then discovered American football as a way to give him something to do, and turned out to be pretty good at it. So I think sometimes as well as that drive and that determination to succeed, and like what you said, creating that positive environment, whatever that environment is, in order for them to succeed and not do these other things.
Yeah, I think, there's a bit of stuff emerging about, adversity and resilience and the importance of that. I think it's not saying that, there's different things work for different people. I'm not saying that every athlete has to have this environment that's, rainbows and butterflies and everything's perfect. I think A, that's unrealistic. That's not going to happen, but B, it might not be right for everyone. But I think, including the parents as part of that process, irrespective of what that end picture looks like, is massive. The picture will look different for each athlete. I mean, and it's just trying to, keep open communication about what it looks like. For the parent might be doing something that they think is really helpful. So an example of that I've had is a parent being like, before the kid went and played the match, it was like, oh, you can win this, like, just, you're good enough. And for the parent, that was trying to provide support, and that was saying, you're good enough, you can do it. For the kid, when I was working with him, he was then saying, Mum and Dad think I can win, now I've got to win, because they wouldn't tell me that if they didn't believe it. And for him, that was huge pressure. So it didn't really need much. It was just a conversation with kid and parent of, what do you think is helpful for you? And actually the kid then got a greater appreciation of, Mum and Dad are doing this because they want to help and they support me. And the parents got an appreciation of where the kid's angle was coming at. And I think those are conversations that you can have now. It's, when things go back, what would you like things to look like for you? What are some of the challenges that you face as a parent, as an athlete, as a coach? And trying to really break down those conversations. I think it's the lockdown's probably given people time to think about what they really want. And that can be helpful if you can, have that quite transparently of, how can we use this time to mean that when we do go back, that we can make things as helpful for, every person involved in the journey.
Yeah, I think that what you said there, a lot of people can relate to, especially if they've done sport itself, especially growing up as well. And sometimes that environment of having unicorns, don't get me wrong, I like unicorns and pictures of them, but
Me too.
Might be saying something there, might be My Little Pony enthusiast or something. Yes, that environment of rainbows, leprechauns and unicorns are not necessarily the environments that are going to work best for everyone, and it's generating those environments. So as developing practitioners, and even if there are practitioners here watching, what skills should they have learned now whilst they're in lockdown to prepare themselves for the up and coming recession and it's like the new normal?
I think being adaptable.
This is from your own perspective, not necessarily, or anecdotally, shall we say?
Yeah, I think being adaptable. I think, we can speculate about what the new normal, if that's the phrase we're going to use, is going to look like. But no one really knows. I mean, I'm sure there's people far above my pay grade that do know what things are going to look like. But I think, for me, it's trying to really respond to what you can. And I think it's having really authentic conversations, if you're able to, with the people around you and the people that you work with, about what do you need and how can we be of help. I think it would be really easy to get sucked into I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and I'm going to do this and these are all my grand plans. The reality is we don't know when the world is going to go back to what we were used to. So I think being adaptable is huge. How do you use your skill set and how do you adapt that to the differing situations that you're placed in. But yeah, I think it's hard to say any more than that, but I think it's just being prepared and ready to adapt to what you need to adapt to.
That is super powerful information and tips you've given there. A lot of people, yeah, no, you're welcome. You're welcome. A lot of people have got in contact with me, Richard, of the DCEP Northern Applied Hub, and a lot of students wanting to know what could they do, as you mentioned, adaptability. What could they do now within ethical guidance of HCPC to utilize their skills potentially to earn money if necessary? From your opinion, obviously within ethical guidelines, what could they potentially do?
I don't know. That's a question I'm best placed to answer, if I'm honest. I think
that's fine.
I think it's tricky. I think, you know, financial security is very much understandably something people are looking for. I think doing that ethically within sports psychology is a challenge. I think I'd be cautious of giving a response to that because I don't really have the answer myself. I think it's a great question, and I think I can really appreciate why people would like an answer to that. Unfortunately for this interview, I think it's one that I'm not able to answer. I think there's people far further down the line that could probably give a more accurate and sensible answer to that. But yeah, right now I don't think that's something I'm able to give an answer that I would be happy with too.
No, that's fine. That's I think that's a very brave and mature answer you've given there by not giving an answer to potentially to that question. But likewise, like you said before, the ethics is highly vital and important, and for people outside of psychology, they don't necessarily understand why we need such a strong ethical basis and background to why we apply ethics to psychology. Have you found that out yourself when you interview people or talk to people from outside of sports psychology about having to be ethical all the time while you're working?
For sure. I think it's tricky. I think there's a bit of a dichotomy between ethical practice and business. And ultimately, sport is a business, and people will view their practices as a business. I think, whenever you go to a job interview in whichever field that is, one of the first questions you'll probably get asked is, what have you done before? What's your experience? How sports psychology fits into that is obviously I would argue it's quite individual. I think people take different approaches to that. I think for me, it's, issues around confidentiality, anonymity are huge. I think that's something that people from outside the field and maybe even sometimes within the field don't often, focus on as much. I think it's a challenge in terms of, how do you promote yourself as a practitioner, and this is me, this is what I'm doing, versus, how do you fit within those ethical boundaries and frameworks of, how you're practicing safely, how are you maintaining anonymity, confidentiality. I think it's a tricky one. I think it's one that people probably don't appreciate initially because, you see it everywhere. It's when someone gets on for an interview, when they bring on a sports coach, it's like, here's X coach that's worked with X, Y, Z, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3 teams. So yeah, I think it's tricky, and I think it's one that I think I'm figuring out my own answers to in terms of how that stuff sits with me. And it's one that as a field we're probably figuring out more broadly.
Yeah, I know many many people in the sports psychology field when they say you bring someone on for, I don't know, for BBC Horizon, and they say sports psychologist, and it's, well, no, he's not a sports psychologist. He just happens to write a book about psychology and suddenly ends up being promoted accidentally. But yeah, the ethics is highly important, and there's reasonings why we've got this, and we developed this throughout history. And the HCPC is really the guardians of that within both the British Psychological Society and now BASIS as well. In terms of opportunities, have you had any unexpected opportunities arise from the lockdown itself?
I think the CPD stuff and the networking's probably been the biggest one. I kind of mentioned it a bit earlier that I've done a couple of, webinars with people that I didn't know before the lockdown. And I think, webinars is something that, being honest, I probably wouldn't have engaged that much in. I think it's, as I've alluded to before, the whole internet promotion, social media, etc., probably isn't particularly me, or hasn't traditionally been, I should say. So I think that's probably been like quite a huge opportunity in terms of, doing new things and speaking to new people. And that's something that probably wouldn't have happened without the lockdown. Certainly not right now, at least in my, development. So that's probably been the biggest thing, is just connecting with new people and trying to use some new opportunities.
That's really good stuff there. In terms of how do you think the quarantine will change the way sports psychology will be practiced in the future? And if so, how?
Another big question. You're on the big questions today.
I know. Just blasted them out from a cannon straight out with the big questions. Going for the big ones.
I think it's tricky. I think, again, like it's important to acknowledge that, I'm in my second year as a trainee. So, my
even from a trainee perspective, that can be quite useful as well, because you've got insights that many of the people watching could probably relate to. And obviously you're in that background where you're, well, from my perspective anyway, seeing the changes and experiencing those changes potentially for yourself as a developing practitioner.
Yeah, I think, without being too repetitive, I think the adaptability stuff will be huge. I think probably focusing on different things, possibly. I think there might be an initial shift in terms of what practice looks like. I think for me, the immediate things that spring to mind would be, getting back into training. People have had a lot of time off. How's their motivation? How's their, focus, attention to be able to get back into whatever their routine was, particularly if there was a lot of training involved. I think there's potentially going to be more return to injury stuff required. I think, if people, and I'm probably going to be someone that's just as guilty of this, when the courts reopen, I'm going to be like, right, I want to play all the time. The weather's good. Get me on a tennis court. And I think there's going to be lots of people that as soon as they can go back to their sport, they're going to want to do tons of it. And I think if they're not in an environment that's managing that safely, I think there's going to be some injury risk. There's going to be people that haven't done anything and are going to go, full on. So I think that could become an increased focus. And I think another big one is probably to do with identity, and to do with how do we help athletes manage their identity, potentially create new identities, potentially understand what's important to them. Because, this extended period off has potentially impacted that quite significantly. That's something that people have spoken to me quite a bit about is, well, I'm not playing my sport, and that was such a big part of me that what now? So they're kind of probably the three big strands that spring to mind. But I think, the biggest thing is, for me at least, is putting those to one side when there's a person in front of me and going, what's going on for you? Like, what do you need, what's happening for you, what's your experience has been, and again, adapting to whatever it is that that person needs.
Yeah, yeah, that's very pertinent stuff there, and it's good that you've managed to not just look into a crystal ball and come up with these random things, that you've actually thought them through in depth and in detail. Likewise, guys, if anyone watching this, 2 questions really that's been developed here, and we would really like to know what you guys think about this. Firstly, do you prefer to work dependently and independently as a student, and do you prefer studying in working independently, and as a student, do you prefer studying in a dependent system where you get told what to do, or having that full autonomy and independence to your learning? And really, the second question is, are you utilizing the time in lockdown to network and develop skills? And if so, what are they? Whack them down below, and we'll be really interested in what you guys have to say. Also, as well, if you could subscribe, that would really help the DCEP Northern Applied Hub out a lot. In reference to the next set of questions, what suggestions do you have for new practitioners who want, or people who want to do the route you have done? What suggestions do you have for them?
Ooh, tough. What would I have liked to know? I think figuring out what works for you. I think, there's now quite a lot of pathways available. There's the DPsych programs like the one I'm on. There's a couple more of those alongside the one at Glasgow Caledonian University. There's obviously the BPS independent stage created their own CPA HCPC route. So there's lots of different routes available to you. I think the biggest one is working out what's going to be best for you. How do you like to work? What sort of roles, positions do you think that you'd like to go into? And just asking the questions. I think, supervisors is a big one when you get to the trainee process, is, finding a supervisor that is going to fit for you, that, you think is going to challenge you in the right way, and that, you'd quite like to work with and collaborate with. I think that the other big one is be ready to look inwards, and to challenge yourself, and be aware that, your perceptions are going to change. I mean, as I said, I'd worked with some sports psychologists. They're the ones that kind of made me realize that this was the path I wanted to go down, and I've been, very lucky to have done some work with them. But my ideas of what it is that I want to do, what that looks like, have shifted continuously, and I think it's being open to that, and trying to take as much as you can from different fields, whether that's sports psych, whether that's counselling, whether that's other forms of psych, whether it's social work. There's so much we can learn from different fields, and I think the more you can broaden your understanding and broaden your awareness, the better.
So you mentioned about working and talking with sports psychs. What area from what you've learned is potentially in need of development?
Tricky. I think, and I think it's growing. I think, there's a few new applied journals, the case studies in psychology journal. I think, applied, explaining applied practice could be useful. I think, what does it look like in practice, and trying to bridge that, theory to practice gap. I think kind of linked back to earlier, what I've spoken quite a bit about with the other trainees on my program, is about how things do go wrong, and that's okay, and that also, about being really adaptive to needs. I think for me, it would probably be quite nice, and it's something that, I'm looking at as part of my program, about putting some stuff out there about, how it is sometimes a bit bumpy and it is messy, and you might have the perfect, well, what you think is the perfect plan with your client, and then 2 sessions in you realize that that's not going to work for them right now, and that maybe that's not the right way to go, and that's okay. You just work together and find something new. And I think that's probably that would be quite helpful for people coming into it. I think it's really easy to read and see, like, oh, they just went in and everything worked magically, and then they left and the person was better, and off we go. And I think for trainees, I think it could be valuable to see a bit of, well, it didn't quite go that smoothly. That's something that I'm looking at, trying to do a little bit of. But yeah.
So it's that understanding of individual differences and how everyone is an individual, and that,
Yeah.
like when we with the pilot episode with Richard, he said, oh, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to use CBT, and it's like, okay, but is that necessarily right for the clients or the people you're working with in this situation and context? And is that what we was trying to allude to?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, a little bit to do with therapeutic modality. I think that obviously comes into it. But yeah, I think just like accounting for individual needs, and it, a lot of stuff, at least early in training, in undergrad and masters, it was like, so what's your plan? You've got this situation. What's your perfect plan going to be of how you're going to deal with this person's presenting difficulty? But people are complicated. People are. It can be messy, and that pretty linear picture of what you wrote out that the literature says might happen might not happen. You might get some cases where it does go that cleanly, and I've had some examples where I'm like, wow, everything just fits. They say something and it fits within something, and it just goes bam 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 bam, off you go. But just as you see in all the messy diagrams of the path to success, it's the same thing with psych. And I think being prepared for the fact that that might happen, and how do you respond to the individuals you work with and really adjust to their individual needs is huge.
Question I'm going to ask you now, and we've asked this quite often throughout this, through the Talking Psych podcast, and now on to the COVID-19 sports psychology in the time of coronavirus special. If you had a time machine and you had to go back and have a chat with your former self, what advice would you give yourself?
Probably quite a personal one. I don't know how much this will translate, but I think for me, it's about putting a bit less pressure on to get it right. I think I've always had quite a fixed view, maybe, of like, this is what right is. I think playing a sport like tennis, I mean, the ball goes in or the ball goes out. You can't, like, there's no, oh, well, maybe, like, it was in or it was out. I think that's maybe the way I'd viewed a lot of stuff, and actually, being able to take that step back and go, there's actually lots of different rights, and there's maybe not actually a fixed wrong. Don't get me wrong, there is some stuff that is definitely wrong. But being able to really enjoy the process a bit more, and to get less bogged down in the outcome and more into the journey, and really taking time to read more, explore more. I think that's something I do quite well, but it's something that I've discussed quite a lot in supervision recently, is that enjoying the process of learning and getting better, and trusting that if you keep doing the right stuff and putting yourself in the right positions, that things will work out, and that it's okay if my pace is slower at some points or faster at some points than the people that are around me. It's just about trying to be the best that I can be.
That's really good. It's really good that you can give yourself that personal that reflection there on what advice you'd give yourself, former self, going up through obviously through university and college and that. And before we end this show, guys, what we would really like to know is, what do you prefer, working independently and independently, especially as a student? Do you prefer studying in a dependent system or an independent system where you have full autonomy? And also, are you utilizing this time in lockdown to network and develop skills? Do you have any like personal plugs we could do, or any social media or anything you would like to say? Or
I mean, my Twitter handle, which is the only one I particularly engage in, is at Zoe Moffat SP. So you can find me there on that. I think my email's up there, so if you've got any questions or you'd like to chat, like, feel free to drop me a message. I think, that's something I've been very fortunate to have, is people around me, at all stages of my process, that are really happy to have a chat and help. And I can't always promise that I'm going to be able to give great answers, but if people want to have a conversation about anything that I discuss, then they're more than welcome to get in touch. So yeah, at Zoe Moffat SP.
The answers you've given us here are utterly fantastic, and I believe they'll be able to help those who are watching this stream and later on the Talking Psych special podcast. We will stick that down in the description below with the link to your Twitter handles, so that people can discuss in future anything they potentially would like to with you. Also, guys, if you could visit us on our own Twitter pages at the DCEP Northern Applied Hub, and also it's the same on Instagram. If you could subscribe down below, this would really help the channel and developing the message, and help with the lectures we had previously, and all those kind of getting that information out there to help practitioners like Zoe, or developing practitioners like Zoe, like the undergraduate students and the master students, that we really like to get across information about this kind of thing. Before we like to go, thank you guys for watching. I'm Adam McCarthy from the DCEP Northern Applied Hub. It's been lovely to have you here, Zoe, as well.
No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been good to have a bit of a catch up as well, and definitely some interesting conversation to think about.
Okay, guys. Hope you enjoyed this, and stay safe.
See ya. Bye.